This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. Today we're going to be talking about a very sensitive subject, a subject that I'm sure you've thought about yourself, whether you're a Jew or a non-Jew. The subject is Jews have lived in foreign cultures for many, many years. Unless you're living in Israel, you're living in a very Jewish community somewhere in America or around the world, you're by nature surrounded by non-Jewish elements who are going to have an influence possibly on your lifestyle. Now the question is that if that influence stretches beyond lifestyle to religious belief. And Jews have resisted attempts to try to influence their religious beliefs for thousands of years, based on a strong belief that our tradition dating back to the times of Mount Sinai and beforehand to Abraham and Sarah are based on a strong, particular approach to what it means to believe in one God, what it means to be a Jew at heart. And this is something that's very, very deep within the Jewish psyche and something that's been developed, and each individual develops it in different ways. However, as we all know, there are Jews sometimes who are not educated in their Judaism or haven't had a strong Jewish background to be able to feel the inner strength necessary to at times counter the influences and the attempts to try to bring them into other religious beliefs. And it's important that people understand, both Jew and non-Jew alike, why it is that Jews cannot accept Christianity as being our way of life. And it's a subject that I think needs to be dealt with because it's a subject that many of our young people also deal with and many people in different ways of life ask about and discuss. And Jews and non-Jews alike discuss intelligently and maturely concerning the differences between our two religions. For this, I've asked Professor Lawrence Shiffman, who is the chairman of the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University in Manhattan, to share with us some of his background information as he has in the past on the Jewish Spotlight. And it's a pleasure to have him with us once again. Professor Shiffman, it's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
You know, we're dealing with a subject here that I know has been a topic of conversation for Jews and non-Jews alike throughout history. And Jews have always felt a little bit on the defensive as far as non-Jews, but Christians in particular, making attempts to try to influence us and have us believe the way they would believe. Can you explain, as a start-off, a springboard for our conversation, why, in your opinion, it's clear that Jews cannot accept Christian teachings? Not to deny, of course, Christians have a full belief and right to be able to believe as they wish, but why it is that a Jew cannot accept that belief?
I think the real essence, the core of the Jewish refusal to accept belief that Jesus was the Messiah and is the Messiah, let's make sure we understand what the things are we're talking about, and also that he is in some way divine. I think the core of this really falls into two categories. On the Messianism issue, Jews have always felt that what the Bible says will happen in the prophets when the Messiah comes, and the way the Bible understands the career of the Messiah simply didn't happen. The simple fact is that the Messiah during his lifetime, a human being during his lifetime, according to Jewish tradition, is supposed to bring world peace, bring welfare to everybody, cause everybody to recognize the true God, not necessarily to be Jewish, but to recognize the true God. All of these requirements haven't happened, and therefore for Jews it's a simple matter. We should point out that Christians...
So in this sense, from a Jewish perspective, Messiah is just a person who is really ushering in a messianic era. So he's sent by God in order to be able to conclude that process of the transition between the world as we know it now and the messianic era. So
yes,
therefore,
a very great person, but a person. If that doesn't happen and the person dies, as Maimonides says, then it hasn't happened.
So the emphasis is on the era, not the person.
Yeah, the emphasis is on the era, but the person is a very important part because apparently the way the divine plan works according to the prophets is that we're going to need a great leader who's able to coalesce the world behind the effort of having the messianic era. So the leader, depending on whose sources you look at, which sources, but the leader is going to play an important role, but it's all of us together in the whole world that's going to share in the messianic era. So that's the first part. Jews feel that didn't happen, and therefore the person that they identify as Messiah couldn't have been the Messiah. The second thing, which I think really topped this off, is that it's hard to tell exactly when Christianity adopted the idea that Jesus is divine. But certainly, by the time that the Apostle Paul is speaking, it's very clear that there's an aspect to the divinity of Jesus which says I and the Father are one and stuff like this. And certainly once the Trinity is finally being articulated in the following centuries, it violates the Jewish understanding of what monotheism is. Now, in fairness to Christianity, of course, Christians will tell you on the first question that the prophets don't say what we say they say, and they'll say about the second question that it's still a form of monotheism. But the fact is that for the Jews, we have a tradition which tells us how to interpret the prophets. It starts in the Bible with what you might call inner biblical interpretation. It continues through the rabbis, through the Middle Ages, up till today, and our understanding is that Jesus didn't fulfill the messianic role, and for Jews, any compromise of monotheism at all is considered totally unacceptable. So,
you know, it's very interesting that according to Judaism, we feel very strongly that the Messiah will come, the Mashiach will come. This has been a belief that Jews have died for throughout the centuries. We don't take away the right of the Christians, or for any religion for that matter, to believe what they want to believe. Our interest is just that people lead a righteous life and lead according to the 7 Noahide laws, which are the basic rules of humanity established in the book of Genesis. So the right to be able to take a person, and if they want to somehow, you know, obviously make a religion of this and lead it to have people, or inspire people to lead a righteous life, is an issue that can be dealt with in a separate show, perhaps.
yeah.
But what I think we find difficult is that in the process, our scriptures, our tradition, our view of the reality of our religious core has been taken and used to be able to justify this. If they want to do it, fine. Gesundheit hate, as we say, you know, based on your own scriptures, and do it. But for our purposes, that's where we have a major conflict. How can you use our scripture to be able to justify it?
Let me begin by explaining what they actually think, because we have to understand that Christianity historically believed that the covenant that they entered into when Jesus came and through his death provided them salvation replaced our covenant, and therefore we were no longer the true Israel, but they were Israel. Now, that belief has been somewhat modified in modern times, especially by the Catholic Church officially, who has come along and stated that the Jewish covenant is eternal, but that the Christian covenant is, to pick up words it takes from the Pauline epistles, grafted onto the earlier covenant. Now what that means, therefore, is it's grown further, meaning that in a certain sense their covenant is a better covenant, but they still recognize our covenant. So by definition, whether it's the so-called supersessionism, which says our covenant is out, or it's the dual covenant theory, which says, no, the Jewish covenant is still there, the Jews are still good people, Christianity must square one way or another with the existence of the Jewish people theologically, not just practically. And that is, I think, the root of the part that you're talking about, why it bothers us. Because they can't just say, look, the Jews believe this, we believe that. Because the entire idea of Christianity is to say that the true expression of what the Jews didn't understand correctly is what the Christians stand for. So they have no choice but to incorporate us. And that's the reason why relations between Jews and Christians have been so difficult all along. What we have, in a certain sense, gotten to now is a situation where they incorporate us in a good way instead of a bad way, the way it used to be. But a Christianity without the incorporation of us and our teachings is not possible.
Interestingly. I want to just also mention for our audience, Professor Shiffman is considered one of the world experts on the Dead Sea Scrolls and an expert on that time of history during the time that Christ was walking on the earth and on the times of the temple and the destruction of the temple. And also has been very active in Jewish-Christian interrelationships as far as trying to bring together an understanding of the two communities. So he speaks with a tremendous amount of experience in this area. I think that it's important, though, that we try to explain that with great respect to any non-Jewish audience that we might be viewing this. It's important for the Jews out there to understand why specifically are there scriptures that are used as a proof of, quote-unquote, this being the fulfillment or the second covenant, why we can't accept that.
Now, I think if you take a look, there are certain specific passages that have been quoted. For example, the suffering servant passage in Isaiah, which has been understood by Christians to expect the death and then resurrection of the Messiah. Whereas Jews completely reject this. They believe that the passage isn't even about the Messiah. It's about the people of Israel who has suffered, as we know,
And if
so
we
much.
look in the context, going back to Isaiah 52 and 51,
Right.
you can see this continuum of the development of the suffering servant describing the Jewish people.
Right. Well, that's how we understand it. Now, again, they understand it in a totally different way. What's happened in modern times is that many modern Bible scholars from Christian communities, Catholic and Protestant, will admit that our interpretation is the literal meaning. But nonetheless, they will insist that there's another layer of meaning, which opens up the possibility that a dying Messiah, a killed, suffering Messiah, could be the real idea of the Messiah who would then be resurrected. Whereas we Jews have basically rejected that idea, insisting that the Messiah should be able to do his work during his lifetime and then accomplish it. So that's one of the fundamental problems. There are also some other passages. Another very famous one is the claim that the prophet Isaiah says that the Messiah will be born to a virgin. And this gets into a Hebrew word, which really means a young woman, which is translated in the Greek Bible with a Greek word, which some say means a virgin, but others say means just a human being. And of course, Jews...
How do Christian scholars deal with that?
Well, Christian scholars will again say, that despite that, there's a second layer of meaning, which is there. It opens up a layer of meaning to them, so they will admit that they don't have the only explanation, but they will claim that this explanation is the one of their theology. And the truth is that that is not so crazy a claim, considering that we make claims beyond the literal meaning of the text also. The problem here is that very often in these particular situations, they founded their whole faith on this notion. So virgin birth is not simply an idea that comes from Isaiah. It affects the whole way the story of the birth of Jesus is told, because the whole set of birth stories, or they call it infancy narratives, is designed to prove this notion, despite the fact that the New Testament tells us that his father was actually Joseph. It's a complex issue. But the point I want to make simply is that for Jews, the idea of virgin birth, or the idea that the Messiah has to be born to virgin birth,
is totally foreign.
Is totally foreign and totally impossible.
Mm-hmm. I once had an interesting experience. I was sitting with a woman who started coming to our congregation just to check things out. Turned out she was a Jew who had been in the church for about 23 years. For events that happened in her young life, she decided to go that direction. But she was definitely aiming in the direction of trying to get back into Judaism. And she brought me a list, probably about 3 pages long, of quote-unquote proofs about the Messiah, about why she believed in Christ as the Messiah. And we went through it step by step. And it was very fascinating for me also, because I saw how so many of them were basically, they were quotes from Psalms, they were quotes from Mishnah, from Proverbs, right, quotes from different parts of Tanakh, of the 24 books of the Torah, that were really about life, and they weren't prophecies. So they were dealing with the challenges of life, challenges that he went through as well, and that therefore they were common to everybody. Anybody,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, anybody who had struggles, or anybody who had enemies, anybody who had overcome obstacles and different things. The few of those 3 pages that were actual prophecies, when I sat down with her to explain to her how those prophecies really weren't fulfilled, she was basically totally devastated that her belief that this was a fulfillment of a second covenant for a Jewish person was based on what turned out to be not well grounded.
There's also another issue here. I think that whenever Christian missionaries tried to convince Jews to believe in Christianity, they tried to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, because the Messiah is something the Jews are taught to expect. We say that we believe the Messiah will come at any time, and we have to always believe that he could come tomorrow. So it's easy to say to a Jew, Jesus is the Messiah. But the problem is that in a certain sense, one can say that in Judaism, if someone mistakenly believes that someone is the Messiah, okay, they made a mistake, big deal, right? We know, for example, that Rabbi Akiva believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, the Jewish rebel from 132 to 5 against Rome. Bar Kokhba turned out not to be the Messiah. Okay, so you had an incorrect belief. People have incorrect beliefs every day. The problem of the unity of God is much more complex, and the missionaries know not to discuss this too much. So they minimize the idea that Jesus is, in a certain way, part of a divine aspect. Now, depending on which type of Christianity you deal with, they have these so-called high and low Christology, et cetera, et cetera. But as you go through this, you see that the extent to which Jesus identified with God, already in the Gospels, not just from 325, the way the Da Vinci Code tries to make it out, right? Already in the Gospels, identified as divine is something which, for Jews, is impossible to accept. And every Jew knows that. they all know when we say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," we don't just mean one, we mean a total unity, which somehow cannot be divided. And therefore the notion of three persons, as they call them in the Trinity, or often called the triune God, is impossible. So these missionaries never mention that. But the truth is that that's really where the sticking point is. It's not that Jesus is the Messiah, is not the Messiah. The other very important thing to mention, we haven't mentioned so far, is Judaism is a religion of law. It believes that the Torah that was given, both the written law and the oral law, create what's called in Judaism halakha, which is the law. Now, Christianity has had a love-hate relationship with the law, as we can see by reading the works of Paul. Now, again, one of the things that missionaries sometimes slough off, but there's no question about it, Jews are called upon to accept a code of behavior. Now, in modern times, Jews have debated what this code of behavior is in a certain way, but it's very clear to us that there is a code of behavior. And if you're not willing to follow this code of behavior, which includes moral things, many of which are common with all our fellow human beings, and certainly with the Christians, accept them as well, some ceremonial laws and ritual laws, and the bottom line of this is that that's an aspect which Christianity renders basically obsolete, which Jews are committed to. So such things as the reinterpretation of Passover into a way of celebrating basically the death of Jesus, as some Christians do it today, this type of thing is totally unacceptable to Jews. So I would say that another very important aspect to emphasize, the notion that our behavior has got to be determined by some very specific rules. Now people ask about, well, why should that be? Why isn't faith good enough? The answer to that is because, to put it sort of bluntly, whether I have faith or I don't have faith, whether I accept or don't accept certain beliefs, what I have to know is that there are certain actions that are simply not permitted.
As a personal responsibility.
As a matter of personal responsibility. Now, Christianity has a debate about that, the works versus grace. And those who believe that only grace matters allow a person, just by believing in Jesus, to be saved no matter how bad their life has been. Judaism says, wait a minute, we've got to put much more emphasis on how we live. So that's another very big difference between Judaism and Christianity.
Tell me, as a historian, can you tell us a little bit of the Jewish perspective, what actually happened at that time, based on Josephus, based on other sources that were written at the time in history?
We have to understand that the way the Gospels tell the story of Jesus is a result of the history of Christianity from that very period, let's say about 33, in which he was crucified, even earlier period the Christians call his ministry, his career, up through the end of the first century, so that the Gospels actually display in them the tensions between the Jewish and Christian communities that took place when the Jews didn't accept the messiahship or divinity of Jesus, and they also display the differences of opinion between different Christian groups. Hence, they have tremendous amount of addition to what must have been the core story. The core story, as it's told, to put it very simply, by Josephus and also by the Roman historian Tacitus, is that Jesus was a teacher who attracted a very great following. The Romans were afraid that he was a revolutionary, that his idea of the kingdom of God would lead to a revolution within the Roman Empire. The high priests of the time, we have to understand, were not Jewish high priests that stemmed from the Jewish people. They were sort of stooges, appointees, collaborators of Rome. And these high priests, or the high priest, Caiaphas, perhaps his father-in-law Ananias, they together colluded with Pilate, who was one of the most brutal people in the Roman Empire, who was fired because of brutality eventually by the Roman Empire.
To be fired for brutality in those days, you had to be pretty brutal.
Pretty brutal, right? He crucified enormous numbers of people, and he decided to crucify this guy with the collusion of these stooges that he had that were sort of like collaborators. And that's really what happened. Pilate did it, not the Jews. And because of the later tensions between the Jews who didn't accept him and the Christians, the gospel stories told it the way they tell it.
Interesting. How does Judaism see other religions, whether it be Christianity, Islam?
Judaism looks at other religions, first of all, in terms of the 7 Noahide commandments, these basic human commandments which have got to do with the general morality and believing in God. And we look at just all people. If you fulfill these, you can get into the world to come. That's what we call the righteous of the nations of the world. Judaism does not believe that everybody has to be a Jew to be a good person, and that everybody has to convert to Judaism. On the contrary, Judaism doesn't try and make converts.
Explain why.
Judaism always felt that the commandments that it accepted, which represented a special commitment that it made to God at Sinai, was its own covenant with God, but that the nations of the world had a covenant with God simply to observe a basic moral and ethical way. And if they did that and they believed in God and worshipped Him and followed His moral ways, it was all they had to do. And that was really what they were there for. That's all fine. Now, later on, Jews came into contact directly with other religions. And Judaism does believe, in all honesty, that there are idolatrous religions in which idols are worshipped or in which evil might be worshipped or something like that, which would cause a whole lot of regulations about Jewish contact with those people. But Judaism believes that Christianity and Islam are forms of monotheistic faith, and from the Middle Ages on came to understand very clearly that we relate to these people not as idolaters, but as fellow monotheists. And this also opened up the way for a tremendous amount of respect, even with disagreement. And you see that in the famous Jewish sage Maimonides, in the way in which he speaks about Christianity and Islam as helping to spread monotheism, even while he disagrees very strongly with them and even says some very negative things. But spreading monotheism, spreading the idea of messianic redemption in the case of Christianity. So I would say that Judaism's idea is a kind of respect but great disagreement. Now, one thing has to be added to this. Jews do have a grudge against Christian neighbors and Muslim neighbors for things that have happened to us in the case with the Christians of the past and the Muslims today. When fellow monotheists don't understand that monotheism calls for love of your fellow monotheist and do things which are anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, Jews get justifiably, as they might say,
we're human.
Yeah, that's right. And Judaism does not believe in turning the other cheek. It believes not in keeping grudges, but in maintaining its own history and understanding what was done to us and memorializing it. So with all of the respect for our common monotheism, Jews are quite concerned about ongoing representations of anti-Semitism, and certainly in the Muslim world today where this seems to be a major problem.
But as a historian, looking at Jewish-Christian relationships today and the strides that have been taken, how would you see that in terms of the both of them being able to agree on so many different issues,
Yeah.
in particular, let's say, Israel, and how much progress has been made in terms of relationship between the two peoples?
I think that Jews and Christians have learned a tremendous amount about how to live with one another. There are a lot of challenges that still go on. People always ask these questions, is the glass half empty or half full? Frankly, I don't think that that's what we should ask. The question is, are we going in the right direction? And the question for Jews is not, what is the other guy doing? The question is, what are we doing? Because the Jewish obligation of making the world a better world is to try and go to another person and say, let's do it together. If that person joins with us in doing it together, then we're on the right grounds. We go forward. If they don't, well, you know, the fact is it doesn't change our obligation to still try and do it with them, without them, to get across these points. So I think in Jewish-Christian relations, it's not as if the problem's over. It's simply a question, are we moving in the right direction? We basically are moving in the right direction. There are setbacks, and it's a terrible mistake to give up on this. I just will say personally that one of the things that I am most proud of that I did that almost nobody knows about, I was on a committee to deal with the improvement of the image of Jews in Catholic textbooks. And the Catholic textbook publishers.
Textbooks here in the States?
Yes, in 1984.
Interesting.
It was a committee of the United States Catholic bishops. A number of Jewish scholars aided in the process. Mostly Catholics did it. And the fact is that although it's not a totally solved problem, the progress that this document we created at that time and our work created is unbelievable. And the very fact that Catholics are now carrying on to find the remaining problems is a wonderful effort, and I think we have to realize what we're doing as we're going forward.
Now we have to send you to the Palestinian Authority to work on their textbooks.
Yeah, well, here it's a worse problem, because actually what happened was...
I just said that as a...
Yeah. No,
I don't want to get into it. It's a different topic. But
no, I'm not talking about the Palestinian problem, the
okay.
anti-Semitism problem.
Oh, okay.
The anti-Semitism problem, what happened is that anti-Semitism was exported from Europe
right.
to two places in the Arab world primarily to Iraq during World War II, and to Palestine. And this is now spread, so that anti-Semitism is now a problem in Islam.
We have a major problem.
Right.
Question, to the Jews out in our audience who have either perhaps converted to Christianity or thinking about it or are really not knowledgeable about Judaism and curious about Christianity, what is your message?
Well, the first thing I would say is you got to find out what the truth is about what the Bible says, the interpretations. And I think, to speak in a sort of emotional way, I think the age-old connection of the Jew with Judaism and the line of tradition all the way back to Sinai shouldn't be broken by anybody. And if someone has broken it, it's really a sad thing. And I would hope that people like that would somehow be pulled back to reconsider and to consider whether or not they haven't given up, you might say, the baby with the bathwater, because what often is the case is that what they love in Christianity is the very thing which came from Judaism, and that they, born Jewish, not born Christian, should really consider coming back to their heritage and learning about it. I would also say, at the risk of putting in a free commercial, that there are some tape series around, not by me, so it's free for other people, which explain why Judaism does not accept the specific arguments of the New Testament regarding the prophets. And the one that I tend to recommend usually is the one by Tuvia Singer. And these tape series will give a sense of why Jews disagree point by point with the New Testament, not just in general points. And all of that not meant in any disrespect. To us, it's a tragedy to lose a Jew. We lost 6 million of them to Nazism, and we don't want to lose more.
Millions through history.
Yes, millions through history. We don't want to lose Jews through voluntary.
We're only 15 million Jews now. This is after 3,300 years. We should be 1 billion Jews if it wasn't for all the anti-Semitism and the assimilation that has taken place.
Right. So that's what I would say to the Jew. I would say to the Christians that I hope that you will look and understand in your tradition how your tradition does indeed preach love to everyone, and how it comes out of ours, and how we all can respect each other on that basis.
All right. Well, Professor Shiffman, I appreciate very much your comments and your insights into a very sensitive and, of course, a very important topic. And we hope to see you again sometime in the Jewish Spotlight.
Thank you.
Fact is that this is a sensitive subject, and I hope we haven't offended anybody, but it's definitely something that needs to be thought about by each and individual person living in our community. A community filled with many good Jews, many good Christians, people of all faiths and all backgrounds, many good Muslims and many good Hindus, and people from all over the world. And the understanding that we do come from different backgrounds and we have uniquenesses about us, each of us. But nevertheless, we can live together in a great nation that we live in order to be able to build a better world and do our small part to make this world a better place for each of us, to bring up our children and to enjoy life to its fullest. So with this in mind, let's try to think about how we can reach out to somebody in our community, reach out to somebody to make their life a little better. For any Jews out there who have considered a Christian or Catholic beliefs, reconsider. Give us a call. Talk to your local Chabad rabbi. Talk to somebody who could perhaps shed a little bit of a different light on the view of what Judaism is or what Christianity offers the Jew. And I think you'll be surprised to find something very, very different than perhaps what you found out in the past. Shalom, and we'll see you next week, same time, same station, at Jewish Spotlight.
בשמחת הגיולו, הנה הנה מושיח בו. שישו ושמחו בשמחת הגיולו, הנה הנה מושיח בו. שישו ושמחו בשמחת הגיולו, הנה הנה מושיח בו. שישו ושמחו בשמחת הגיולו, הנה הנה מושיח בו. הנה הוא בו, מושיח צדקנו.